On January 14th of 2023, the ridiculous challenge of beating FF9 without being able to see anything was completed, all in one sitting. It took nearly 17 hours to beat it, and the person to do it was this guy.
Okay, spin to win.
Yes! Yes! Get in there!
It actually happened. Oh my god.
The Brutals has been speedrunning Final Fantasy IX for years and has the world record for the any percent category at the time of this writing. Knowing that, he is more than qualified to be taken on this challenge. So today, I want to share the strategies that made the run not as difficult as you'd think, and why he even took it on in the first place. I'm Dr. Swellman, welcome to the channel, and I hope you all are having a great day. Brutals already knew to some extent that playing the game blindfolded was possible. In fact, there was someone else who did a much smaller version of this challenge first. Back in 2019 at Awesome Games Done Quick, there was a Final Fantasy IX speedrun performed by several runners of the game. One of the donation incentives was to perform the hardest menu of the game blindfolded. Known as the Pandemonium menu, it has over a minute of complicated shopping, ability and equipment changes, and Luzbelheim was able to do it almost flawlessly. As Brutals was doing runs of FF9, he'd think about this and other barriers to beating the game without seeing. After a few months of consideration, he finally started planning out the run, and while Brutals had a lot to go up against, there were many tools at his disposal to help him. When it comes to room navigation, the first thing you'll notice is you can hear the main character's footsteps when moving. Thanks to the stereo setting, you can also hear where the controlled character is within a room. Brutals went through most of the game's rooms and found setups to get from point A to point B, counting steps and listening to make sure your character doesn't get stuck on anything. When it came to the overworld, moving on foot and with vehicles were a little bit more complicated. Brutals needed to use a metronome to precisely time some movements, that way he could stop, set up angles at specific positions, and continue to his next destination. Wait a minute, setting up angles at specific positions? Continuing to another destination? That sounds like something I do while shaving. Wait, is this the sponsor transition? Because this sounds like a sponsor. Let me tell you about this video's sponsor, Manscaped. Manscaped has the solution for all of your grooming needs with their cutting-edge technology. In this holiday season, there's no better gift to give than the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra. This box comes loaded with goodies to get you all cleaned up, starting with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. This thing features two interchangeable skin-safe blade heads, the skin-safe trimmer blade for precision, and the skin-safe foil blade for that close, clean cut. Another really cool feature is a large LED spotlight, letting you illuminate hard-to-see places when trimming up those lower areas. Really useful if you're like me and your vision isn't the best. The package also comes with the Weed Whacker 2.0, letting you clean up those annoying nose and ear hairs with that same skin-safe technology. Then there's the Crop Soother and Crop Preserver lotions to keep you feeling fresh and itch-free after trimming. To get this package at a discount and the Boxers 2.0 plus Shed 2.0 travel bag as a free gift, be sure to go to manscaped.com and use my promo code Dr. Swell for a cool 20% off your next order, plus free international shipping. Thanks again to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. Now that I've sold my soul to the corporate gods, we're finally free to talk about one of the bigger barriers to this run, which is menuing. Item management starts from the very beginning of the game, and it heavily relies on not getting extra drops. In FF9 speedruns, you're fleeing from most encounters anyways, so this isn't a big issue outside of a few fringe cases. Equipment is always sorted by power, and abilities are always in the same place, giving even more consistency with the menus. When it comes to random encounters and boss fights, menu navigation isn't too bad either, with each character having their own unique ability underneath attack. By selecting the ability, then using R1 to move pages, you can identify the character that you selected through the sound effects. There's a small amount of overlap here with Zidane and Freya, but their other unique attacks are not in the same spots within that menu, so identifying them just takes one extra step. As for knowing what enemies you're up against, bosses are pretty self-explanatory, but for random encounters, you can just listen to the enemy's roar before anyone's ATB gauge starts increasing. With that all out of the way, Brutals was ready to do his run, so he set up a subscriber goal incentive to do the blindfolded playthrough, all while in blank cosplay. Taking a look at Brutal's blindfolded run, the first couple of discs weren't a problem for him, taking about 7 hours to get through. The only big hurdle in Disc 1 is stealing the Mage Masher from the first fight. Brutals had no way of knowing if he got it or not, and even though he nabbed it really early, he still made attempts for a few minutes to make sure he stole it. Outside of that, the only other major barrier is sensory deprivation and not falling asleep during the run. I mean, if you sat down in a blindfold for 17 hours, not seeing anything but like pitch black, you're probably gonna pass out. So after 7 hours of only seeing pitch black, Brutals needed to take a half-hour break to make sure he was good for the rest of the run. During this time, he sat at the title screen in order to not see his saves, and only resumed after putting back on the blindfold. Going into Disc 3 and onward, that's where the game slows down to a crawl, and strategies become much more complicated. Surprisingly, the Tetramaster tournament in Treno wasn't that big of a deal. Even though some time was spent trying to win 3 matches in a row for the Rebirth ring, completing the section in less than 30 minutes was absolutely incredible. The first of the run's major issues was getting to Kuja's palace, navigating the overworld to reach Oilvert, and menuing correctly to ensure certain abilities were enabled going into the Arc fight. Remember when I said some overworld map movement was really complicated? This is by far the biggest barrier to a blindfolded completion. When you fly into the Forgotten Continent, you're dropped in an area that doesn't have a clear path to Oilvert and have to do some extreme movements to reach the location where you can board a chocobo. From there, it's all about not getting stuck on walls or the airship. By moving in certain ways, you can slide across the cliff sides and avoid being stuck in a corner. With all this in mind, it took Brutals over an hour with a few resets back to Kuja's palace for him to succeed. While he did make it to Oilvert, there was one thing Brutals messed up that would stall him for nearly another hour. When setting up his abilities, he missed enabling level up on Freya. This lets characters earn 1.5 times the normal experience from encounters, leading into one of the run's big requirements. Brutals wanted Freya to learn Counter, which allows a user to counterattack sometimes when hit with a physical attack. This lets characters deal a lot more damage over the course of a fight, ending them faster and making the run safer overall. Missing level up here put Freya a level behind, causing Brutals to miss one magic stone and keeping him from equipping Counter for an upcoming boss. Despite not having Counter, Brutals was able to make do with what he had, but this was only the first sign on what was to come as he reached the next big hurdle in his run. Right before going into Desert Palace, there's a minigame that's required to release the party from their jail cells. This involves getting a key from a Hedgehog Pie's jail cell without being detected, then setting up to get on the upper platform to turn the hourglass over. The kicker is that there's a 6-minute time limit before having to reset. So how did Brutals manage to get past this part?
So I explained it during the ESA stuff. That was 2 of the incentives, was to do Blindfolded Hedgehog Pie, which is red light, green light for those that don't know, simply. The thing that actually makes it difficult is that you can only hear the red light, and it doesn't actually have an audio cue for green light. But the only thing to pay it to know is that he can't look at you for more than 4 seconds. So he can turn away and look back within 2 seconds on the quickest cycle. So actually, no, there's another detail to talk about here really quickly. I don't know what the timings are for these, but he has these fast turns as well that he can do whenever he wants. They're probably on half-second timers, I'm not really sure. But if you fail 5 times, he loses access to that. So if you hear him turn to you and you count, and you can keep a decent timer in your head and then just add a little bit, you get a couple taps of movement if he's not been looking at you for those 4 seconds. And you might only get a few, or he might look at you again and you might not get to move at all. So it's you have to be very patient. You have to be very, very patient. And when I practiced it, I actually practiced it on an emulator that had like a recognizable amount of input latency, which I wasn't aware of. So when it came time to do it on hardware, I found, and it took me hours. It took me hours and hours and hours and hours, and I was so chuffed when I finally got it. I was over the moon.
Now that the hardest part of the run seemed to be out of the way, Brutals appeared to have a clear path to the end of the game. He did have to reload a couple times to get past a few menus and bosses, but up until Disc 4, things seemed to smooth out. The start of the final disc has you going through the Nova Dragon fight, and while he had some bad luck here to start, he was able to make it through. Unfortunately, the upcoming Chaos Guardians would not be as easy. Marilys was a big issue due to Brutals being unable to figure out Freya's abilities and equipment for this fight. Upon defeating her, she does a desperation attack that usually wipes the party. This is one of the reasons we have the Rebirth Ring, giving 1 use of auto life during an encounter. The problem here was that Freya kept getting equipped with the power belt instead of the Rebirth Ring before the fight, causing many game overs. This was because of the way equipment optimizing was working on Freya, and with the equipment menus getting messed up along the way, Brutals was out of sync with his usual strategy. Since this was something Brutals couldn't overcome with his normal strats, he used slower strategies that involved back-rowing Zidane and hoping he'd survive while dealing less damage overall. This was a big issue because a lot of time was being wasted, and he needed to get the Excalibur 2 after the 4 Chaos Guardian fights, allowing Steiner to make quick work of the rest of the run. Getting this weapon is only possible when your in-game time is less than 12 hours when reaching the point you can obtain it. Brutals kept having trouble with menus going into Kraken and Tiamat. Since Freya didn't survive the Marilys fight, she didn't learn Devil Killer, decreasing her damage against Kraken dramatically. Zidane also ended up equipped with auto regen instead of auto life, not giving Brutals the safety net he needs in case things go wrong. Brutals had some menuing issues going into Tiamat as well, but he was able to overcome them quickly and get past the boss with minimal problems. Lich was next, and while Brutals was very close to wiping due to Steiner getting stopped in an unlucky earthquake, he still beat the boss first try. Thankfully, with only about 10 minutes to spare, Brutals was able to get Excalibur 2, and with that in hand, it was time to take on the final bosses. For Death Guys, Zidane is just backrowed while Steiner wails on the boss, hitting the damage cap with his new weapon. Transkuja is pretty simple, as Steiner's charge ability doesn't cause the AoE attack Flare Star to activate, which has the possibility to wipe the party fast. Necron is a weird fight, especially with many of Freya's abilities and equipment being out of sync here, so Brutals tries to complete the fight with Freya, mostly soloing it to keep things safe. Necron starts off with Blue Shockwave and Protect, abilities that are pretty much harmless. After this, Necron would usually use Grand Cross and Neutron Ring, wiping the party. However, if you kill everyone off except Freya, then have her jump at the right time, Necron will just skip using Grand Cross. This results in him starting his turn scripting over and using Blue Shockwave 3 times before trying Grand Cross again. If done correctly, you can keep him in this loop and he'll never be able to cause a party wipe. The only problem here is if Freya happens to go into trance. Normally when jumping, you go up and come back down after a few seconds. While in trance, you stay in the air and throw spears down at the boss. During this time, Necron is skipping turns and may end up on his second or even third Blue Shockwave depending on how long you're in the air. Essentially, you have to keep track of the amount of time you're in the air and hope you didn't miscount. This happened to Brutals after setting up his jumping, but he was able to figure out that Necron was on Blue Shockwave too and got himself back on track. Near the end of the fight, he revived Steiner and charged his way to victory.
G fucking G.
They win?
G, yeah, time.
I figured he's using money.
He can't keep getting away with this.
After almost 17 hours in a single stream, he actually did it. What was once thought impossible was completed by a man who convinced me that Burmecia was pronounced Bermechia in my last FF9 video. I only started playing FF9 for the first time when I was making that video, so I was over here thinking that Brutals would never take advantage of my innate goal ability. Anyways, if you're not doing anything and you have 17 hours to burn, I highly recommend that you all check out Brutals' Blindfolded run in full and sub to his channel. You'll be able to see all the amazing strategies I've talked about here and even more that I wasn't able to cover. Stay hydrated, folks, and thank you all so much for watching.